She does not deserve that. The words cut through the restaurant so cleanly that even the sound of silverware seemed to disappear. For a moment, nobody moved. A server standing near the kitchen entrance froze with a tray in his hands. A couple celebrating an anniversary looked up from their table. Even the pianist in the corner missed a note. The entire dining room had just witnessed something that almost never happened. Someone had challenged Richard Hayes. Richard slowly turned around. At 6 feet 2 inches tall, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, he carried the kind of presence that made people straighten their posture when he entered a room. He was one of the wealthiest business leaders in New York. His companies employed thousands of people. His name appeared in magazines, business journals, and television interviews. But inside this restaurant, he was known for something else. People feared him. The young server standing across from him looked terrified. Moments earlier, the employee had accidentally delayed one of Richard's orders by a few minutes during a busy dinner rush. It was not a major mistake. Yet Richard's frustration had quickly filled the room. Nobody had interrupted him. Nobody ever did. Managers usually apologized. Staff members usually lowered their heads. The evening usually continued. But tonight was different. Standing between Richard and the nervous employee was a woman wearing a simple black waitress uniform and a neatly tied apron. Maya Johnson, 29 years old. First week on the job. Knew enough that she still checked table numbers twice before approaching guests. Knew enough that she had not yet learned the unwritten rules of the restaurant. Rules like never getting involved when Richard Hayes was unhappy. Rules like avoiding eye contact until he calmed down. Rules like letting management handle the situation. Maya had broken every one of those rules in less than 10 seconds. Richard stared at her. The dining room held its breath. "Excuse me?" he asked. His voice was calm, but everyone nearby recognized the warning hidden inside it. Maya did not step back. Her heart was racing, but it did not show on her face. She glanced briefly toward the embarrassed employee before looking back at Richard. "I said she does not deserve that," Maya replied. The silence became even heavier. A manager standing near the host's stand looked as though he wanted to sprint across the room and stop the conversation before it became a disaster. Several staff members exchanged worried glances. One waitress quietly whispered, "Oh no." Richard folded his arms. "And what exactly do you think you know about this situation?" The question carried enough weight to make most people retreat immediately. Maya remained still. "I know she made a mistake," Maya said. "And I know she is trying her best to fix it." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You have been here less than a week." "That is true. Then perhaps you should focus on learning your job." A few people looked away, expecting Maya to apologize and walk off. Instead, she surprised everyone. "Part of my job is treating people with respect," she said softly. The words were not loud. They were not aggressive. Yet they landed harder than a shout. Nobody in the restaurant could remember the last time someone spoke to Richard Hayes that way. Not because the statement was rude, because it was honest. And for the first time all evening, Richard Hayes had no immediate response. The silence lingered so long that several customers began pretending not to watch, even though every eye in the restaurant remained fixed on the same place. Richard Hayes stood motionless, studying Maya Johnson as though she were a problem he had not expected to encounter. Throughout his career, people usually reacted to him in one of two ways. They either agreed with him immediately or found a reason to leave the conversation. Very few chose a third option. Maya had just chosen it without hesitation. The young employee behind her still looked embarrassed. A manager finally rushed forward, forcing a nervous smile. "Mr. Hayes, I apologize for the inconvenience. We will make sure everything is handled properly." Richard did not take his eyes off Maya. "I am sure you will," he said. The manager swallowed hard. Everyone knew that tone. It was the tone Richard used when he was not finished. Around the dining room, staff members quietly exchanged glances. They had seen difficult evenings before. Some had worked at the restaurant for years. They knew Richard's reputation almost as well as they knew the menu. When his reservation appeared on the schedule, employees suddenly remembered errands in other sections. Servers traded tables. Managers prepared themselves for complaints before he even arrived. The strange thing was that Richard rarely yelled. He did not need to. His disappointment alone could make people uncomfortable. Maya, however, knew none of this history. She had started working at the restaurant only days earlier. To her, Richard was simply a customer who had spoken harshly to someone already trying to correct a mistake. Nothing more. Nothing less. Richard finally broke the silence. Do you always involve yourself in situations that do not concern you? A few nearby guests leaned closer. Maya considered the question carefully. I think respect concerns everyone, she answered. The response surprised several people. There was no attitude in her voice. No challenge. Just sincerity. Richard folded his arms. And you believe you understand respect better than I do? Maya shook her head. No, sir. I just think everyone deserves it. The manager looked ready to faint. One server near the kitchen quietly covered her mouth. Nobody could remember the last time someone had continued a conversation like this instead of retreating. Yet Maya remained calm. Richard noticed that. Most people became nervous when he questioned them. Maya seemed focused on the situation rather than herself. That made her difficult to dismiss. You are new here, Richard said. Very new. Yes, sir. Then let me give you some advice. Business works because people are held accountable. Maya nodded. I agree. Richard looked mildly surprised. You do? Absolutely. Accountability matters. She paused briefly. So does dignity. The words settled across the room. Several employees looked down at the floor. Not because they disagreed. Because they wished they had possessed the courage to say something similar themselves. Richard stared at Maya for a moment longer. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of arguing, he glanced toward the nervous employee who had made the mistake. The young woman looked as though she might burst into tears from stress alone. For the first time that evening, Richard seemed to actually notice her. The restaurant remained silent. Customers stopped eating. Staff stopped moving. Everyone sensed that something important had shifted, although nobody yet knew exactly what it meant. And for the first time in years, Richard Hayes found himself thinking about a question he rarely asked. What if the person standing against him was right? Richard Hayes did not answer immediately. That alone was unusual enough to capture the attention of everyone nearby. The billionaire was known for decisive opinions, quick judgments, and an unwillingness to second-guess himself. Yet now he stood quietly in the middle of the dining room while customers and employees watched in stunned silence. Maya Johnson remained calm. She had not stepped forward looking for a confrontation. She had simply refused to look away when someone needed support. The young employee beside her still appeared overwhelmed, clutching a small order pad as though it were the only thing keeping her steady. Richard glanced toward the employee again. For a brief moment, he noticed details he would normally overlook. She looked exhausted. Her hands trembled slightly. She seemed less like an incompetent worker and more like someone trying desperately to keep up during a demanding shift. The observation unsettled him. The restaurant manager quickly stepped forward, eager to restore normalcy. Everything has been corrected, Mr. Hayes, he said. Your order will be ready in just a few minutes. Richard nodded without looking away from Maya. I am sure it will. The manager forced a smile and retreated. Around the room, conversations slowly resumed, but only in whispers. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Maya expected Richard to dismiss her and return to his table. Instead, he surprised her. How long have you worked in restaurants? He asked. The question seemed to catch everyone off guard. Maya blinked. About 8 years. Richard raised an eyebrow. 8 years. Yes, sir. And you still believe people deserve patience after mistakes? Maya smiled faintly. Especially after mistakes. Richard studied her expression. There was no sarcasm there. No attempt to embarrass him. Just conviction. That is not how business works, he said. Maya considered his words carefully. Maybe not all businesses. Success requires standards. I agree. Then what happens when people fail those standards? Maya glanced around the restaurant. You help them improve. Richard almost laughed. And if they keep making mistakes? Then you teach them again. Several employees exchanged looks. The conversation had become strangely personal. It no longer felt like a disagreement about a delayed meal. It felt like two different philosophies colliding in public. Richard folded his arms. You make it sound simple. Maya shook her head. It is not simple. Her voice softened slightly. But being frustrated does not automatically make someone better. The words landed harder than she intended. Richard looked away for the first time. Something about the statement lingered in his mind. Across the room, a customer quietly set down a coffee cup. Another stopped reading a menu. The entire restaurant seemed suspended between curiosity and disbelief. Then the young employee who had made the mistake spoke for the first time. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I am sorry, sir. Richard looked at her. Really looked at her. The fear in her eyes was impossible to miss. Suddenly, he remembered his first job as a teenager. Long hours, nervous mistakes, managers who could ruin an entire day with a single comment. The memory arrived unexpectedly, and standing there beneath the warm lights of the restaurant, Richard Hayes found himself confronting something he had not considered in years. Perhaps the reason everyone avoided him was not because they respected him. Perhaps it was because they were afraid of him. The realization lingered in Richard Hayes's mind long after the young employee apologized. Fear. The word refused to leave. He glanced around the restaurant and, for the first time, noticed something that suddenly seemed obvious. Nobody was looking directly at him. Employees moved carefully whenever they passed his table. Managers monitored every detail of his experience with unusual intensity. Even customers seemed aware of the tension surrounding him. For years, he had interpreted those reactions as professionalism, respect, efficiency. Now he was not so sure. Maya Johnson noticed the shift in his expression. She had expected him to dismiss the entire conversation and return to his meal. Instead, he seemed distracted by his own thoughts. The dining room gradually returned to life, but the atmosphere remained fragile. People continued watching from the corners of their eyes. Richard finally looked toward the young employee again. "What is your name?" he asked. The question startled her. "Emily, sir." "How long have you worked here, Emily?" "Almost 6 months." Richard nodded slowly. 6 months. She was still learning, still trying to find confidence, still making occasional mistakes like every employee he had ever hired. The comparison arrived before he could stop it. Years earlier, some of the most successful executives in his companies had been inexperienced employees who needed guidance and patience. Yet tonight he had offered neither. Emily lowered her eyes. "I am sorry about the delay." Richard looked at her for a moment. Then something unexpected happened. "Thank you for apologizing," he said. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze again. A server carrying water nearly stopped walking. The manager blinked twice as if he had misheard. Even Maya looked surprised. The response was not dramatic. It was not emotional. Yet everyone present understood how unusual it was. Richard rarely softened once he became frustrated. Maya saw uncertainty in his face now. Not weakness. Reflection. The kind that appears when someone begins questioning a belief they have carried for a very long time. Richard turned toward Maya. "You seem very confident for someone in her first week." A faint smile crossed her face. "I am not always confident. You could have fooled me. I was nervous." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You did not look nervous." "That does not mean I was not." Several nearby employees exchanged amused glances. The honesty of the answer made it difficult not to smile. Richard found himself smiling as well, although only slightly. "Then why say anything at all?" he asked. Maya considered the question carefully. "Because staying silent would have bothered me more." The answer landed with surprising force. Richard looked away for a second. Throughout his career, people had challenged his decisions in boardrooms and negotiations. But those confrontations usually involved money, strategy, or power. This was different. Maya had spoken because of principle. There was nothing for her to gain. No promotion waiting. No advantage to earn. If anything, she had risked creating problems for herself. Yet she had done it anyway. That fact stayed with him. Across the dining room, employees slowly resumed their work. Customers returned to conversations. The immediate tension had faded. But something important had changed. The fear that usually followed Richard wherever he went had been interrupted by a single voice willing to stand its ground. And as he returned to his table, Richard realized he was no longer thinking about the delayed meal. He was thinking about Maya's question without her ever asking it. If people feared him, had he spent years mistaking fear for respect? Richard Hayes sat alone at his table after the conversation ended, but the meal no longer held his attention. The perfectly prepared entree in front of him had grown cold. The expensive bottle of wine remained untouched. Across the dining room, employees continued working, yet something felt different. For years, Richard had walked into restaurants, hotels, conference centers, and corporate offices expecting people to react a certain way. They moved faster. They spoke more carefully. They became nervous. He had always assumed that came with success. Wealth created pressure. Influence created expectations. At least that was what he had told himself. Tonight, for the first time, another explanation seemed possible. The restaurant manager approached cautiously. "Mr. Hayes, is everything satisfactory now?" Richard looked up. The manager's smile appeared professional, but there was tension behind it. The kind of tension Richard suddenly realized he had seen hundreds of times before. "Yes," he answered. "Everything is fine." The manager looked relieved. Not pleased. Relieved. The distinction bothered him. A few minutes later, Maya Johnson returned to refill his water glass. Several employees discreetly watched from a distance. They expected another confrontation. Instead, Richard surprised them. "Can I ask you something?" Maya nodded. "Of course. Have you always been this direct?" A small smile appeared on her face. "Only when I think it matters." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Most people would have stayed out of it. Most people probably know more about you than I do." The answer caught him off guard. "What does that mean?" "It means I did not know who you were when I walked over." Richard stared at her. For the first time all evening, he laughed softly. Not because the answer was funny, because it was honest. Maya had not challenged a billionaire. She had challenged a situation she believed was wrong. The distinction mattered. "And if you had known?" Richard asked. Maya considered the question. "I still would have said something." The laughter disappeared. Not from tension, from realization. She meant it. There was no performance in her voice. No attempt to impress him. She simply believed what she believed. Richard glanced around the restaurant again. Employees moved between tables. Customers enjoyed their meals. Life continued. Yet now he noticed something he had never paid attention to before. The staff seemed exhausted. Not lazy. Not careless. Human. A server rushed to help an elderly couple with their coats. Another employee carried a heavy tray while smiling politely at guests. The young woman named Emily was still working, concentrating intensely on every order she entered into the system. Everyone was trying. Not perfectly, but sincerely. Richard thought about the companies he owned. Thousands of employees. Tens of thousands of mistakes made every day. He did not expect perfection from all of them. He expected effort, learning, and accountability. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten to extend the same understanding to people outside his boardrooms. Maya finished filling the glass. "Anything else I can get for you?" she asked. Richard looked at her for a moment. Then he shook his head. "No," he paused briefly. "Actually, yes." Maya waited. Richard glanced toward Emily and then back at Maya. "Thank you." The words were simple. Yet several employees nearby immediately looked up. Because in a restaurant where everyone expected complaints from Richard Hayes, gratitude sounded almost unbelievable. And as Maya walked away, Richard found himself wondering why one waitress had accomplished something that years of success never had. She had forced him to look at himself honestly. The rest of the evening passed differently than anyone expected. Richard Hayes remained at his table, but the atmosphere surrounding him had changed. The tension that usually followed him like a shadow seemed weaker now. Employees still worked carefully, but not with the same visible anxiety. Word had quietly spread throughout the restaurant. The billionaire who normally intimidated everyone had thanked a waitress. For many employees, that alone sounded impossible. Maya Johnson continued moving between tables, delivering meals, refilling drinks, and helping customers with the same calm professionalism she had shown all night. She did not behave as though anything extraordinary had happened. In her mind, the situation had never been about winning an argument. It had been about protecting someone who needed support. Yet the people around her viewed things differently. During a brief moment near the service station, Emily approached her. "Thank you," she whispered. Maya looked surprised. "For what?" Emily smiled nervously. "For saying what nobody else would say." Maya shook her head. "You would have done the same for someone else." Emily laughed softly. "I am not so sure." Before Maya could respond, another table requested assistance, and she returned to work. Across the room, Richard noticed the interaction. He watched the employees speak with Maya and realized something important. People trusted her, not because she held authority, not because she had money. They trusted her because she consistently treated people with dignity. The thought stayed with him. Trust had always fascinated Richard. In business, trust could determine whether companies succeeded or failed. Entire partnerships depended on it. Yet somewhere over the years, he had become so focused on performance that he rarely considered how trust was built on a personal level. A few minutes later, the restaurant became unusually busy. Several large parties arrived at nearly the same time. Orders filled the kitchen. Servers moved quickly between tables. The pressure increased for everyone. Richard watched the staff navigate the rush. Mistakes happened. Small delays occurred. A drink was delivered to the wrong table and quickly corrected. An appetizer arrived later than expected. Nothing serious. Just ordinary challenges during a busy night. What surprised him was how Maya responded to each situation. She never appeared frustrated. She solved problems calmly. She listened before speaking. She treated every customer as though they mattered. Even when someone complained, she remained respectful. The approach seemed simple, yet it created a completely different atmosphere around her. Customers relaxed. Employees relaxed. Problems became easier to solve. Richard found himself comparing her leadership to the leadership lessons taught in expensive executive seminars. The irony was difficult to ignore. Some of the most effective leadership he had witnessed all year was coming from a waitress carrying a tray. Eventually, Maya returned to check on his table one final time. "How is everything?" she asked. Richard looked up from his meal. "Much better." Maya smiled politely. "I am glad to hear that." Richard hesitated before speaking again. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Where did you learn to handle people like this?" Maya thought for a moment. "Life." The answer caught him off guard. "Life?" She nodded. "When you spend enough time helping people through difficult days, you learn that everyone is carrying something you cannot see." Richard sat quietly after she walked away. Those words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Because for the first time in a very long time, he wondered how many people he had judged without ever asking what they were carrying. The restaurant finally began to slow down as the evening moved closer to closing time. The rush had passed. Conversations softened. Chairs emptied one table at a time. Richard Hayes remained seated longer than usual, watching the staff finish another demanding night. Normally, he would have left hours ago. Normally, he would have moved on to another meeting, another decision, another problem waiting to be solved. Tonight felt different. The questions Maya Johnson had planted in his mind refused to disappear. Everyone is carrying something you cannot see. The sentence repeated itself each time he looked around the room. Near the service station, Maya was helping another employee organize receipts and prepare closing paperwork. She never acted as though she had done anything remarkable. That puzzled Richard. Most people who challenged someone powerful wanted recognition afterward. Maya seemed uninterested in it. She behaved exactly the same way she had before. Eventually, Richard stood and walked toward the front of the restaurant. As he passed the service station, he overheard part of a conversation. "How is your mother doing?" one employee asked Maya. Maya smiled gently. "Better this week." "That is good news." "Very good news." The employee headed toward the kitchen, leaving Maya alone for a moment. Richard stopped. "Your mother?" Maya looked up. "Yes." "She has been sick?" Maya nodded. "For a long time." Richard hesitated before asking another question. "And you are taking care of her?" "As much as I can." Her answer was simple, direct. Richard noticed the exhaustion hidden behind her smile for the first time. Not dramatic exhaustion. The quiet kind. The kind carried by people who spend years putting someone else's needs ahead of their own. "That cannot be easy," he said. Maya laughed softly. "Most worthwhile things are not." Richard found himself unexpectedly curious. "And you still manage to work full-time?" "More than full-time sometimes." "Why?" Maya looked surprised by the question. "Because bills do not disappear." Richard nodded. The answer sounded obvious. Yet he realized how long it had been since he thought about life that way. His world was filled with quarterly reports, investment opportunities, and strategic growth plans. Maya's world involved medication schedules, grocery budgets, and making sure another person was cared for. Neither reality was imaginary, but one of them was much easier to forget. "Is that where your patience comes from?" Richard asked. Maya thought for a moment. "Maybe." She glanced toward the dining room. "When someone you love is struggling every day, you stop expecting perfection from people." Richard stood quietly. The words settled heavily. Over the years, he had built entire systems around performance. Targets, deadlines, expectations. Excellence mattered. He still believed that. But standing there, listening to Maya, he realized he had spent very little time considering the human side of failure. The reason behind mistakes. The stories people carried into work every day. Maya checked the clock. Her shift was almost over. "I should finish cleaning before the manager starts worrying," she said with a smile. Richard smiled back. "Fair point." As she walked away, he remained standing near the entrance. For the first time in many years, Richard Hayes was not thinking about business. He was thinking about character. And the more he learned about Maya Johnson, the more he began to understand that her courage had not appeared that evening by accident. It had been built slowly through years of responsibility, sacrifice, and choosing to keep going when life would have given many people a reason to quit. Richard Hayes left the restaurant that night, carrying something far heavier than a business briefcase. The streets of Manhattan were quieter than usual as he stepped into the back of his car. Normally, he would spend the ride reviewing reports, answering messages, or preparing for the next day's meetings. Instead, he stared out the window and thought about Maya Johnson. Her words followed him through the city lights. Everyone is carrying something you cannot see. By the time he reached his penthouse apartment, he realized he had spent nearly an hour thinking about a waitress he had met only a few hours earlier. The realization was unsettling. Not because Maya had challenged him. Plenty of people had disagreed with him over the years. What unsettled him was how easily she had exposed something he had never questioned about himself. The next morning, Richard arrived at his corporate headquarters earlier than usual. The building buzzed with activity. Assistants moved between offices. Executives prepared presentations. Meetings filled the calendar. Everything appeared normal. Yet Richard saw things differently now. During a conference call, he noticed how quickly people agreed with his suggestions. During a strategy meeting, he noticed how carefully employees chose their words. At lunch, he observed how nervous a junior manager became after making a small mistake in a report. For years, Richard had interpreted these reactions as professionalism. Suddenly, they looked different. They looked familiar. They looked exactly like the expressions he had seen in the restaurant. Fear disguised as respect. The thought followed him throughout the day. Late that afternoon, he called his executive assistant into his office. She had worked with him for nearly 7 years. Loyal, competent, professional. "Can I ask you an honest question?" Richard said. She looked surprised. "Of course." Richard hesitated. "Do people here respect me, or are they afraid of me?" The silence that followed felt longer than any business negotiation he had ever experienced. His assistant looked genuinely uncomfortable. That alone gave him part of the answer. Finally, she spoke carefully. "I think many people admire what you have accomplished." Richard nodded. That was not the question. She lowered her eyes for a moment. "Some people are afraid of disappointing you." Richard sat quietly. The answer was diplomatic, but he understood what she meant. For the first time, he allowed himself to remember moments he had ignored for years. Employees becoming nervous when he entered a room. Managers apologizing excessively for minor problems. Talented people avoiding direct conversations with him. None of those reactions reflected trust. They reflected caution. As evening approached, Richard stood alone in his office overlooking the city. The skyline stretched endlessly beneath the setting sun. He thought about Maya caring for her mother, working long hours, facing challenges he could barely imagine. Yet somehow she had remained kind, patient, grounded. He, on the other hand, had spent years surrounded by success and still struggled to show basic grace. The realization was difficult to accept, but it was also necessary. Because for the first time in a very long time, Richard Hayes was no longer asking how successful he had become. He was asking what kind of man he had become. 1 week later, the restaurant manager almost dropped the reservation book when he saw a familiar name appear on the evening schedule. Richard Hayes. The news spread quietly through the staff room within minutes. Employees exchanged nervous glances. Some expected another difficult night. Others wondered whether the strange transformation they had witnessed the previous week had been temporary. Maya Johnson simply continued preparing for her shift. She did not spend much time thinking about it. Whatever happened next was not hers to control. As the evening crowd began arriving, the restaurant slowly filled with conversation and warm light. Then, just after 7 o'clock, Richard walked through the front doors. The room noticed immediately, but something felt different. There was no tension in his posture. No impatience in his expression. He greeted the host with a genuine smile and thanked her when she led him to his table. The host nearly forgot to respond. Several employees watched from a distance, unsure what to make of it. Richard noticed their surprise. He could not blame them. For years, he had trained people to expect the worst from him. Trust was not rebuilt in a single conversation. It had to be earned. Throughout the evening, he made a conscious effort to pay attention. He thanked servers when they brought food. He spoke politely with staff. When a small delay occurred with one of his orders, he simply smiled and continued his conversation. The reaction around him was subtle but unmistakable. Employees relaxed. Shoulders lowered. Smiles appeared more naturally. The atmosphere changed. Near the end of the evening, Richard stood from his table and walked toward the center of the restaurant. Conversations gradually quieted. Employees looked up from their work. The manager appeared concerned for a brief moment, uncertain what was about to happen. Richard stopped near the service station where Maya was organizing menus. She looked up, surprised to see him standing there. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Richard turned toward the staff gathered nearby. "I owe all of you something," he said. The restaurant became completely silent. An apology. Several employees looked genuinely shocked. Richard took a slow breath. "For a long time, I believed that high standards justified the way I treated people." He glanced around the room. "I was wrong." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Richard continued. "Success means very little if people only listen because they are afraid." His eyes settled briefly on Maya. Someone reminded me of that. Maya lowered her gaze slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. Richard smiled. "The truth is, respect cannot be demanded. It has to be earned." The silence that followed felt completely different from the silence of the previous week. That silence had been filled with tension. This one carried understanding, gratitude, relief. The manager nodded slowly. Several employees exchanged emotional smiles. Emily, the young employee from the previous week, wiped a tear from the corner of her eye before anyone noticed. Richard then turned fully toward Maya. "Thank you," he said. "Not for challenging me. For helping me see something I should have noticed years ago." Maya smiled softly. "People can change when they want to." Richard laughed quietly. "I am beginning to learn that." As he walked toward the exit, the atmosphere inside the restaurant felt lighter than it had in years. Employees returned to work. Customers resumed conversations. Life continued exactly as before, and yet somehow completely different. Maya watched Richard leave and then returned to her responsibilities. She did not celebrate. She did not boast. She simply carried on. Because she had never been trying to defeat a billionaire. She had been trying to protect another person. And in doing so, she accomplished something far more powerful. She reminded a man with extraordinary influence that character matters more than status, dignity matters more than pride, and sometimes the bravest person in the room is the one willing to stand up when everyone else stays silent.